All right, everybody, welcome back to HR Heretics. Today we have an awesome episode with Michelle Delcambre. Did I say that right, Michelle?
You got it. Close enough.
Okay. All right. So your career is awesome. You led talent at Zenefits, Okta, and Databricks before joining Stripe as the head of people operations. And you were at Stripe from 2,000 to 6,000 employees. Now you're an operating partner at Felicis, which is one of the best early stage VCs in the world. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
All right. So I want to talk about the Benchmark Your Org thing that you guys just launched at Felicis. And I think this tool is so dope because it's one of the things that I've thought a lot about when I've been in the operating seat. It's like, how does my company compare against other companies? How big should this org be? So can you just describe what the benchmarking tool is and why you guys created it?
Yeah. So I'm going to quickly back my way into the answer and talk a little bit about why I did it before I talk about what it actually is. So the net is this: founders or their HR leaders are asking me all the time how their org should grow. And I frankly didn't have the best answer. Everything available to me felt anecdotal, which didn't feel valuable to them. Second, employee spend is the single biggest spend for most founders, right? And there are a crap ton of benchmarks out there that measure financial efficiency and go-to-market metrics. There's a ton of stuff around SaaS benchmarks, but these metrics for how teams grow didn't exist. They didn't exist in this format. And so I felt like it was missing in the market and wanted to create it. And finally, the metrics that do exist are so SaaS focused, right? The unicorns of a decade ago were consumer companies. Most recently, the unicorns have been SaaS companies. So all of our metrics fit that model. The unicorns of the next decade, though, are not likely to be SaaS companies. And so I wanted to create benchmarks that are relevant beyond one type of company, that could be customized based on a broader set of filters and could update as this publicly available data changes. And then the last thing I will say is, years ago when I was at Atlassian, if you're a candidate who I recruited at Atlassian, the story will resonate. But I used to be really excited to tell people this story about how Atlassian had this hockey stick growth and we had no boots on the ground sales force. It was this really awesome model we had. And of course, now everyone knows what PLG is. But back then it seemed really novel and cool to me. But our org grew very differently as a result of that than what other orgs around us were seeing. And so it would have been very interesting and cool for us at that time to be able to have a model that was more relevant for how our org should grow. And so all of those things kind of led into us creating this thing we're really excited about called Benchmark Your Org. And what it is a free to use tool that leverages real data from 15,000 companies, and it spans the most common functions a startup has. So you can log in, you can select your stage, your sector, your sales motion, your revenue range, and your valuation range. And you get a plan that shows how you stack up relative to your industry peers as it relates to your org design. And the other thing I will say about it is, I said this to you, Nolan, when we spoke before, but I think benchmarks are shit because they become dated so quickly. And they're only useful as long as the data remains constantly refreshed. And so the data for this tool will be updated monthly so it stays current and relevant.
So 15,000 companies is a massive fucking data set. Like, how did you guys pull that off?
Yeah. It's a good question. So we actually partnered with a company called Findem, which, if you're not familiar with them, they are designed as a recruiting tool, but they had all of the data we were looking for. And I wanted to do this and I wanted to do it quickly. So it made sense for us to partner with someone who already had access to the data. They have something called a talent data cloud platform that generates these dynamic 3D talent data images, and it pulls from a variety of sources. There's a big long list from publicly available LinkedIn to GitHub to Stack Overflow to Census Bureau and company funding announcements and patents and publications and personal pages. And there's all of this data out there. It just wasn't used in a way that was allowing us to get these benchmarks. So we used their data and inputs along with our filters and assessments around revenue, sales engine, et cetera, those things to create these benchmarks. And as I said earlier, it's 15,000 companies, but it is only ever going to include companies that have fundraised in the last 10 years, because we think as companies get older, the data becomes less relevant, and it will update monthly. The thing I'm most excited about is I think we'll start to see trends in how certain types of companies grow over time that may be different than what has been standard in the past. And so that's the thing I'm kind of most excited about as this evolves.
Why do you both think that you had to build this? Like, I'm just going to, it's Heretics. This is off script, of course, in my usual form. It's 2024, and you went out, Michelle, and you couldn't find anything that was helpful. Like, why is that? I mean, I'm glad you created it. I can't wait to use it and check it out. But I feel like should have been here like 15 years ago. So what's going on?
Yeah, I don't know. I think the technology that's available to us today, the data sets that are available, the way we can model data and generate data looks a lot different than it did even 4 or 5 years ago. And so I think technology has evolved in a way that's allowing us to do this. And I mean, frankly, I also think we rely on this benchmark practice that's like, go out, run a survey, it works. So we just keep running the survey every year. And I don't think there's ever been a desire to recreate it or do something a little easier than it has been in the past.
Yeah, I agree with, I think it's tech too. Like, I remember when we were at DoorDash, we had these questions all the time. And the way we would get these questions answered is we would go to Sequoia Capital and we would just ask like, hey, these are the 10 things that we want to know that are important to us. Like, can you just go get those answers?
Same.
And Sequoia did an amazing job of keeping their data for their portfolio as clean as possible. But that wasn't the same at other VCs. Like, other VCs like didn't care about it. The operators inside of the company already have so much shit to do that like actually like reporting out on this so other companies can get the benefit of their data is not something that they're usually thinking about. But I just want to like click in for people to tell them like how important I think that this is. So I just ran a little report using the tool. And there's so many things that you can see. So like one is headcount by function. So like how big should each of these orgs be depending on your stage, your size, your company, your revenue size, all these things. Management versus individual contributors, which is one of the things that Kelli and I have talked a lot about. I have a take that I think we're going to start seeing way more ICs than managers. Like what is the overall headcount? And then also attrition. And like what you can expect from attrition by function. So Michelle, how did you come up with like, those are the things that people really care about?
The attrition one specifically, I will touch on. Part of it is just normalizing attrition. It never ceases to amaze me how often founders are like, we don't want to lose people. And I'm like, actually, you kind of do sometimes want to lose people. And sometimes you want to be the one who makes that decision that people should leave your organization. And the others are, I think there are a lot of things that contribute to a healthy organization, managers to ICs, not just from an org design perspective, but we're not going to accomplish this with the benchmark, but from how they engage and how information funnels from one level to the next, I think is important when you think about building a healthy organization. And so I think just understanding this sort of ratio of managers to ICs and what that should look like in your org is just critical, right? So these are all pretty straightforward metrics. And to your point earlier, Kelli, it was shocking to me that I couldn't go out and just say, why can't I see how many managers I should have to ICs? Or why is there just this standard ratio across the industry? And so really it was that these things were missing and I couldn't find an answer for these specific questions. Mm-hmm. There were a handful of other things we thought might be interesting, but it was difficult for us to get the data where we wanted it to be, specifically around things like diversity across orgs or across functions. And so that may come out in a future version of this, but we couldn't get the data right for this go.
And a lot of us, a lot of folks in the CPO head of people's seat are looking at metrics now that are a blend of the business and the people, right? Not the usual suspects on spans and layers and attrition and et cetera. So are you all thinking about, or have you put in there things like revenue per employee, right? Percentage of spend on R&D, et cetera. Like those things have been creeping up more and more.
Yes.
We've gotten in front of it, but that's something that I think people leaders need to start influxing into their strategies.
I agree with that. I could talk to you all day about the sort of missing people data metrics that don't exist today. I will say we are working on a V2 of this that's specifically for Felicis founders that will hopefully allow us to pull in the types of data you're talking about and will also allow us to drill more deeply into specific companies. So a founder can say, I actually only care about this chosen peer group and it's these 5 companies. What have those companies done? And so we're working on a V2 of this that goes deeper and covers these things that you're talking about, awesome, along with other things.
That's awesome. I'm excited. I mean, applaud for you all and more that we influx those stuff in there and make those metrics mainstream into the people world. I think the more we'll be at the table, so to speak, which I don't like
this thing is dope. Like if you're a chief people officer, head of HR, and you take this to your founder, like this actually feels like you're showing up to the conversation with actual data that your founder probably hasn't seen. So Michelle, where can people find this?
It is www.felicis.com/benchmark. Or if you just Google Felicis Benchmark, it comes up.
Sick. Okay. I want to transition to talk about the talent vortex. So you've talked about this quite a bit on LinkedIn. It also has to do a bit about the attrition conversation that we were just happening. So can you just tell us what is a talent vortex?
Yeah. So I think of a talent vortex this way. It is a company that has built something in a way that it is pulling in the best talent out there from the right backgrounds, call it the right universities, the right experience, whatever. And it is bringing them in for a period of time. That talent is improving and making that company better. And on the back end, that company is sending that talent out into the world better than they brought it in. And they're going on to do things like found their own companies, which is how we've sort of modeled the talent vortex images. But they're also going on to do bigger, interesting jobs at other startups and other companies that are out there to do cool things.
So Michelle, you know that startup founders don't want great employees to leave, right? Like there's all these things that we feel when a great employee leaves, which is, oh my God, like, how am I going to explain this to the board? How am I going to explain this to the company? But like, you're actually describing, I think, a thing that's really common amongst great companies, which is not only do they recruit great talent, which everybody agrees with, but then that great talent that they coach and they invest in then goes into the world and does other things. Like,
yeah.
talk about like how you feel about when talent leaves and why we look at this the wrong way.
I think there's a couple of things here, right? Like, I think of every company, and I'm going to distill this down a bit. There's like a team 1, a team 2, and a team 3. And a great employee at team 1 is not necessarily the same great employee at team 3, for example. And so I think there has to be this natural attrition that's happening to keep the performance level or to sustain peak performance across your organization. I think that's natural, and I think you should push for that. And I think in some cases that means talent that you don't need anymore is leaving. And I think in some cases it means talent that's actually still great talent is also leaving your organization. And I think that's healthy. And I also think really good founders want that. And I would challenge, if you are telling the outside world that you are building an organization with the top talent and none of that talent is ever leaving, I would question whether or not that really is the top talent. Are these really the most innovative people? Are these really the people with the best ideas who are capable of doing bigger, greater things all the time? I'm not sure I believe that that's true if they're all staying at your organization forever and ever.
Michelle, what in your experience, what are the top reasons why founders don't want people to leave? Like when you dig in, like what is that gut reaction? Like, no, they can't leave. What are those themes and how have you helped them get over that?
I think it's a couple of things. I think first, and the biggest thing is, I think people think if people leave, founders and executives think if someone leaves your organization, it's actually because you've done something wrong. And in some cases it is, but in some cases it actually isn't. And so I think helping founders to overcome and to my point earlier about normalizing this concept of people should be leaving your org. And in fact, you should have a mental model of how and why and who should be leaving at any given time, I think is important. So the normalization of that, it's not that you've done something wrong, it's that this is a natural sort of part of running a business is one thing. I also think hiring is hard and it's expensive and it takes up a lot of time. It never ceases to amaze me how often a founder is surprised by how much time they are spending on people and hiring related things. And so I think there is this worry that they're going to be spending more and more and more and more time on this if they can't keep people. And all this, I want to caveat this by saying, I do think you should be keeping most of your people for a period of time, right? I'm not saying everyone should be leaving on a regular basis, but I do think that there should be some natural, healthy attrition. And so I think normalizing that people are leaving is one way of doing it. And the other thing is, I think strong HR leaders should be modeling and forecasting out based on things like performance, whether or not you want to retain them from an equity perspective, who should be leaving, when they should be leaving, and what percentage of each function should be leaving at any given time. And I think if HR leaders are taking the lead on doing that, then it helps to make it a natural part of running the org as opposed to this weird, unnatural thing that's happening off to the side.
Totally. That was my Family Feud #1 answer, by the way. Founders just, it exhausts them to hire. It exhausts them to do the agency, the time, all these things. And so, and then on the HR side, I've seen a tendency to like not plan for that until boom, someone goes, and now we're flat-footed. And so that's why it's even more exhausting, because you're behind the 8 ball and the whole thing snowballs. So I love that. Totally agree. Hey, everyone. We'll be right back in a moment after a word from our sponsors.
Here's a crazy stat. Between hybrid and frontline employees, about 80% don't typically work in an office. So it's no surprise that digitally engaging employees is the #1 concern for CEOs as companies go hybrid. But as hybrid is quickly becoming the norm, it's easy for workplaces to start feeling a little less human. Yet delighting a digital workforce is possible, and it can even be, dare we say, fun. That's where WorkVivo, Zoom's employee experience platform, comes in. If you've ever recoiled at the thought of a static intranet that looks like something you built in 1995 using MS Paint, have no fear. WorkVivo is a dynamic, intuitive, accessible, and mobile-first tool. People actually like using it, which is why companies like Ryanair, Dollar General, Virgin, and more have rolled it out to hundreds of thousands of employees. WorkVivo's activity feeds, spaces, shoutouts, and live streams, among other features, help elevate the employee experience like never before. The result? Dramatically better retention, productivity, and most importantly, connectedness. A greater sense of the belonging we all crave at work, whether we sit at a desk or drive a truck. Make WorkVivo the digital heart of your organization and achieve limitless human connection. Head to workvivo.com to book a demo and make sure you tell them that Nolan and Kelli from HR Heretics sent you. There's a world where your CRM is powerful, easily configured, and deeply intuitive. Attio makes that a reality. Attio is a radically new CRM built specifically for the new era of companies. It's flexible, easily configures to your unique data structures, works for any go-to-market motion from self-serve to sales-led. Attio automatically enriches your contacts, syncs your emails and calendar, lets you create powerful reports, and quickly build Zapier-style automations. The next era of companies deserves more than a one-size-fits-all CRM with an outdated UX. Join 11 labs, replicate, modal, and more. Try Attio instantly at attio.com. That's ATTIO.com, and tell them Nolan and Kelli from HR Heretics sent you. Also, we call it literally regrettable attrition. Like, I don't know if we could call it like a worse thing. I remember putting together board decks at Carta and having literal anxiety when talking around regrettable attrition and knowing that one of the board members was going to be like, well, what the fuck happened here? How did we lose this person?
Yeah. It's like they left, you suck attrition. That's what it's called.
100%. I think there are things you can do though, right? There are things you can do, probably not at earlier stage, but at later stage around really nurturing your alumni population. I think is important. The other thing is lots of companies see boomerang employees. And once that starts to happen, and once you encourage that, if you're reporting on that, it sort of offsets this like, ooh, somebody left. What happened? Because yay, somebody came back. What happened? Right. And so I think we miss those opportunities.
Michelle, you nailed it. I had a post a couple of months ago around this, is like reframing regrettable attrition to incredible alumni.
Yeah, totally.
And it's just like, it also turns out that if you can have people leave in a way to where like they feel like they learned a lot, that they got a ton of value out of that experience, that you maintain the relationship, not only while they're at another company, could you potentially leverage that relationship to help your current company, but your point around boomerangs is something that I don't think is discussed enough. Like we used to have this feeling in the early days of DoorDash that has now since changed. But it was like, you're either with us or you're against us. And that was a really short-sighted perspective that we had at the time, because it was like, we were competing against Uber. And so it was like, we needed everybody all in all the time. And as the company has now matured, many people have gone back and are now working there again. And so talk to me a little bit about like boomerangs and why you think that that's so important.
Well, actually, I'm going to answer this in two ways. I'll start with my answer on boomerangs, which is this. Like, when you see people coming back, it helps to solidify that it isn't necessarily that there's something wrong with you. The timing was off. What that person needed was different, right? There was another opportunity that was going to grow them in a way that you couldn't necessarily at that time. We saw a ton of boomerangs at Atlassian. And it's because we had reached a level of scale that was no longer interesting or relevant to that person. And then later on, we reached another level of scale that suddenly was interesting or relevant to that person. And we could grow, develop, enable them in a way that we weren't really set up to do at the prior level of scale. And so I think that that's why the boomerang is important, because it signals that you're growing in a healthy way and you're not actually pushing people away because they don't like you. It's just the timing is wrong. And the timing doesn't stay right on any one thing forever. And the other thing I will say, which is less about boomerangs and more about this alumni population, and to your point about you're either with us or against us. Like, imagine if you join a company and you're surrounded by really amazing people, that's great. But imagine if you're surrounded by amazing people and you also have this amazing alumni network that you also benefit from and you are in the company of, and your name is mentioned alongside. Like, that still helps to attract talent, even though those people are gone. And if you view it that way, then it becomes a talent attractor as opposed to something negative that's happened in your org.
You know, Kelli, that reminds me of what Colleen McCreary says, which is like, you want to be from a great place.
Yeah.
And it's so critical. Like, it sounds so obvious when you say it, but just as somebody who has like been on the inside, when somebody you love leaves, like in that moment, especially if you get surprised, which I think is a separate conversation, but like if you get surprised in that moment, all you can think of is like, oh my God, how am I going to explain this to the board? What the fuck are we going to do? You're just thinking of all of the negative ramifications of that person leaving.
Yeah. I mean, we've talked about it a bunch, being a great company to be from. You have to help people move on and celebrate what they're doing next. And I remember one company, it was, I had a board slide that we were churning out this great talent, and they were founding new companies and they were doing big things, and that was celebrated. And so I think it's somewhat on us too, to like make that a part of the strategy. Not just plan for it or play defense, right? You're actually playing offense with it and expecting it and holding up a flag when you get it right,
Yeah.
Now the whole team is leaving and there's a bunch of themes. It's like,
yeah,
good job, leader. You're churning out great people and you're ruining. Like, there is a balance here to this. Totally. But I think the tides are changing for sure.
Yeah.
Michelle, you did hit on one topic that I'd love to unpack, which we haven't discussed on the show, but I am increasingly hearing more of from HR leaders, which is, when obviously we want great talent to stay, but then also it's okay if they leave. But you had mentioned something specifically around like what happens like when like equity or comp gets way out of whack, right? So we hire somebody in the early days. They've been, they're absolutely instrumental, and maybe their role isn't as instrumental now moving forward, but we had comped them in such a way to where now we're looking at them and saying like the comp for the current role doesn't actually justify what they're doing.
Yeah.
Talk to me a little bit about how, those situations and how you've handled them.
Look, I think that's natural. I think this happens in every organization. I think the way you build your comp structures and your comp philosophy becomes more sophisticated and more rigorous over time. And there's almost never a world where you don't end up in a scenario where you have someone who is over or underpaid. And so the basic HR practices around writing compensation, I think, are important. I think where you run into problems is in early days, not even the earliest days, I'd say somewhere around series A and B, where you have a little more cash to spend and you start the easy button. Comp is the easy button when you're hiring. I can't close this person, so if I just pay them more, I will close them. And in some cases that works, but I would argue in a lot of those cases, and this is our point before, is that then those people end up not producing or not growing or not expanding in the way that you need them to justify that comp over time. And every year they're looking for market refreshes and merit grants and all of those things. And so you increasingly have to give them more to keep them engaged and to keep them around. And so I think in those cases, like, I'm a big fan of the pay for performance model because then those people don't make more money over time. They kind of stay where they are until they are within the right range, and then they start to move up. I think the conversation we had, Nolan, that you're remembering is one where I said, I think the word I used is that early stage comp is broken generally.
Exactly.
And I was referring more to just this, like, I think the equity bargain we make with early employees is flawed in that we ask early employees to take less cash in exchange for a larger ownership stake in the form of equity. So basically, we keep people from becoming cash rich by keeping salaries low in the short term, and then give them an equity offering that requires them to be cash rich to purchase it so that they can potentially see financial upside in the long term. And I think there are a lot of problems with that I'm happy to go into.
Interesting. What about like tender offers and secondaries that those early employees arguably can take way more advantage of than the rest of us coming in later and pay for all those like 30-cent options?
Yeah, those happen so much later though than like, it's not like they're happening in the first 2 or 3 years. They're happening at like, I mean, I think Stripe has only done a handful and only recently has done one that really makes early employees who are going to lose their equity grants whole. They don't happen soon enough for those employees. And I think my issue, Kelli, is this, right? Like, given how many startups fail, this whole like model around that is extremely risky, but a startup has almost no chance of success if they can't get good employees to join them. So really any future success a startup might have is built on the backs of these earliest employees who took the biggest risk and took the lowest salaries and more often than not actually end up losing. And I think my other issue is that we have this equity model that was designed at a time when companies were going public way faster than they are now. If you think of the biggest private companies right now, Stripe is like 14 or 15 years old. Databricks is a decade old. Chime is 12 years old. Take your pick, right? And it used to be that the IPO window was like 4 or 5 years. And we have this model that was designed for that time that no longer exists because companies are choosing to remain private for so long. And I think I also break this into two populations of people, Kelli, to your point. I'd argue that the very earliest employees, call it the first 10 to 20 who join at siege or at seed stage, take the largest risk. The companies are cash strapped, salaries are low, especially compared to market. They offer these large chunks of equity in the form of ISOs, which cost money to exercise. So the choice is this: stay with a company for 10 to 15 years, hope that there's a secondary offering at some point in the interim, or walk away from value you helped create in the company because you believed in them, took a risk, sacrificed cash for ownership. And no one stays with a company for 10 years. And to my earlier point, the people you need from day one are not the same people you need at Series C or Series E or whatever it is. So it doesn't actually benefit employers to keep their earliest employees for 10 to 15 years anyway. But the comp model is built to support this.
It so is. You're spot. I'm going to get on the soapbox for a second because I've been thinking about an article on this topic, but it's actually multi-pronged. So you're exactly right. There's this trade-off between cash and equity in which you are taking less cash for more equity ownership. And the recruiting pitch, as I've given it a million times to candidates, is, hey, you're going to join early, and if we're successful, you're going to have a disproportionately large outcome. Right. That is true if you exercise your options.
Yes.
And this is the piece that like nobody talks about that I think is actually it really disproportionately affects early stage employees that do not come from wealthy backgrounds, which it turns out like the majority of early stage employees don't. And so I've told this story once before, but when I left DoorDash, it was $70,000 for me to exercise my shares, and I didn't have $70,000. And so I didn't exercise, and then at IPO, that was worth millions. And I think there's a couple pieces on this. One, there's the post-termination exercise window. Carta just like last week said 50% of employees that leave are now not exercising their options. That's one piece. The other piece that we never talk about is the tax code. The tax code is built in such a way to where if you're an investor, right, not only can you get long-term capital gains, which is taxed at the lower rate than labor, which is absolutely insane. But then in addition to that, you can get QSBS if you invest early, such that like the first 40 to 50 million, if you're in there before the company has $50 million in assets, you get zero tax.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, if you're an employee working your ass off building this company, you have a massive tax,
Yes.
even if there's no liquidity because of the gain in the strike price. So it's like you're screwed from both angles. And I don't actually hear about anybody trying to change this. And so what's your take? Like, is it even fixable? It doesn't seem like there's any inertia to fix it.
That's my question is what, like if I'm listening to this episode, what do I do? Do I give more cash, less equity? Do I offer them to pay for their equity 2 years in kind of thing?
I think there's 4 options, right? One is simply to make it common practice to extend the exercise window to align with the IPO timelines of today, right? There's some economic trade-off. The option pool is going to need refreshing at a faster rate. Unexercised options aren't going to go back to the pool. There are people who would argue that's unfair to those still with the company. I don't really think that's a fair argument. I think the stronger argument against extending the exercise window would be that there's a scenario where companies can't increase their pool fast enough because the board won't approve it, and then they can't keep high performers or get new talent, right? So that requires companies to be more thoughtful with their pools earlier on.
And investors to take more dilution.
And investors to take more dilution, 100%. There is a unique idea that I was floating around for a while, but to your point about the tax implications, Nolan, we kind of tabled it, but I had this idea that specifically for the first 10 employees, that you could decrease the risk for those employees by creating a special option pool that seed stage founders could leverage to attract early non-founder employees. So it would be this new class of shares that would provide downside protection and share liquidation preferences with the investors in a downside scenario. Because if you join a seed company and it fails at B, there's a sell-off or an acqui-hire, whatever it is, and the investors get taken care of and the founder gets taken care of, and those first 10 employees who took all the risk get nothing, right? The problem with this is it doesn't help with the longer term exercise problem if the company does well, but I do think it makes it easier for startups to attract top talent earlier on. And there's an economic acknowledgement of the risk that they took. But the problem with it is that the tax implications of the special pool of stock for those people is terrible. Like the increased tax burden is so high that it actually hurts employees more than the economic benefit might actually help them. And so it's hard to get creative about how to incentivize employees without acknowledging that the taxes are a problem.
Yep.
There's one other unique solution, which is to split your original equity grant into common and founder preferred, where every employee gets some sort of
I was just going to bring this up. So Howard Lerman, who is the founder of Yext. He's now the founder of a company called Rome. I saw him speak last year and he blew my mind with this idea. He was like, the notion that founders get this insanely cheap stock to exercise and early employees don't is inherently unfair. Mm-hmm. And so what he has done for like the first 25 employees at Rome is he has called them founders and given them founder shares. And I had never even considered this idea because it's like, it feels so far out of left field that you would give non-founders founder shares. But when you actually think about the implications of it, it is the way to like bend the rules. So I'll try my best to explain this, but you tell me if I miss any gaps. So basically, when you get founder shares, they are insanely cheap to exercise, and you basically exercise them right away. So any appreciation on those shares, you will not pay taxes on until there is a liquidity event.
Right.
Versus with options, options typically are more expensive and can be very expensive, especially if you're joining like Series A, Series B, the company's doing quite well. And most employees don't even have the opportunity to early exercise those options. That's actually something that you have to ask for or typically negotiate. And so that's what I learned from Howard. And I was like, holy shit, that's a great idea. I feel like more founders need to push it, but I don't even know if enough founders know about it.
Know that it's an option. The other thing is with the common shares as they exist for employees today, the ISOs that you're talking about, they don't get the opportunity to sell those in future fundraising rounds at fair market value until the company is valued so high that it's almost too late. But founders can share at or sell at every fundraising round. Investors can sell at every fundraising round, and right. And so, and I don't think anyone right now is feeling bad for successful founders or successful investors, right? But there is this early population of employees that people should be feeling bad for.
I'd like to scratch at. No one really. They don't even know about it. Who does know about this? Like, Michelle, did you just read about this? Did you think about it at midnight one night? Like, is Compensia out there telling people this? Because I've never heard this, and I've been working with Compensia for 15 years.
Yeah. I mean, I think I read about it. I would not say that I'm an expert in tax law or equity or shares or any of this stuff, but I would say that I'm an expert in hearing the phrase, my equity is broken, or I can't afford to exercise. And so I can see the themes and the trends that suggest there's a real problem here. And so I just started reading about what is possible. And I started exploring, what if we just made a whole new, like a whole new type of share? Like what would that mean? But then we started talking to, 409A evaluators and tax people. And it was like, whoa, hold your horses. This is actually worse than you think it is. And I don't think the IRS is into being creative about fixing the tax code to
also, they're not, the 409A people aren't either, because they haven't seen it.
Right.
And because this is what I learned at Carta, is it was so hard to innovate in the 409A space because they're pattern matchers. They've only seen what they've seen. And so when you're trying to innovate, they're like, well, we don't know what that's going to mean for your valuation. And they don't want to deal with that shit. So Kelli, when I heard this in November of last year, I was like, holy shit. Not only is it a great idea, you literally have a founder that's taken a company public who is saying, I think this is the way that we should be doing this. And I am personally doing it. And every investor who invests asks me this question. And I say, it's the right thing to do for employees. And so again, huge shout out to Howard Lerman, who's the CEO of Rome, for pushing this. And I think like, this is a piece of this conversation I'd love to cut out and share with more people, because it needs to get more discussion. And by the way, go ahead.
I'm digging into this because I believe this is how new practices start.
Yes,
right.
Exactly.
This is how shit changes with someone like Michelle, or how, like, being like, listen, here's the deal. And I asked specifically why, it hasn't changed. And the answer is because we've always done it this way. Because we don't want to deal with it. And tech, anything you want, like, insert the blank. Laziness and a little bit of fear and complacency is usually the reason. And that's
there's just other shit to focus. To be fair, there's just so much shit to focus on when you're building a company that it's like, oh my God, like, are we really going to go break ground in the area that actually doesn't have to do with our revenue?
Well, I don't mean the companies, Nolan. I mean just the general rule makers. We don't want to change things. That's what I'm trying to get at here. I think founders would do it in 2 seconds if it was laid out. It's a thing. It's a thing that needs to change, and that's why I asked, and I love it. This is great.
Okay.
I want preferred founder shares is my takeaway.
You should demand that in your next role. See how that goes.
I actually think if you joined an early stage company, Kelli, that was less than 20 people, I think you'd be surprised at that you'd probably be able to get it done. I just think nobody asked for this either, because they don't know how to ask.
And while we're here, Michelle, I do have a question for you. To the spirit of the cobbler's children usually have no shoes, right? The HR folks, chief people officers. It's amazing to me, because I mentor and coach a lot of folks during their offer process, what we ourselves don't think about or ask for in these offer negotiations. And if you had to pick kind of one area or one thing that you would counsel anyone listening to pay attention to in their own offers, what would that be?
I think a thing that the exit packages, specifically around shorter tenure, pre-negotiating those, especially above a certain level, I think is an interesting approach. And especially when you are joining an earlier stage company, those are two separate things, right? Senior at a later company or joining an earlier stage company where there's high risk. And in a lot of cases, founders are new to hiring. They're not quite sure what they need. They make a hire. They don't exactly know how to make that person successful. So it's a failure and they want that person to go. And so I think that's an interesting thing to consider is sort of pre-negotiating exit. I also think one of the things we did at Zenefits, which I thought was interesting, was for our employee referral program, when we had people wanting to negotiate more equity in their offers, we would say, we'll give you the equity package we initially offered you. And if you can join us and you can help us hire 6 amazing people in your first 6 months, we will give you're actually acting like an owner. And then we will give you more of an ownership stake to align with what you're asking for, because you've delivered on something that actually helps the business. And so I think those types of things where there's going to be an ask of you in the business, if you can negotiate something around those, I think is interesting too.
That second piece is such a good idea. I have never heard that either. I do want to come back to pre-negotiated severance and the look that Kelli gave.
I know.
Which is because of me, by the way.
We argued about this about 7 months ago.
Yeah,
and so
it's been a while.
When you said that, I was like, fuck yeah.
Michelle's argued against it.
So let's talk about pre-negotiated severance. I've done it twice. With executives. And it turned out in both of those cases, we exited those executives in less than a year. So again, N of 2, right? Very small sample size. But the pattern for me was like the people that are pre-negotiating their severance is like they're already thinking about leaving. Like, what the fuck is going on here? It feels like a red flag. So educate me as to why that shouldn't be the case.
I mean, I hear you say that and I think, yes, but why? Like, who has that much time that they're like, I'm going to go through this whole interview process. I'm going to leave my current job. I'm going to start a new job and I'm going to think about quitting from day one. That just seems like an awful lot of work.
It seems like Nolan's assuming bad intent here, Michelle, is what it seems to me.
And I think most people have good intent. I would argue, and Nolan, you're never going to invite me back, but I would argue that there was something missing in the interview process. There was something missing in the job scope or enabling them post-hire that actually led to them leaving. And while I think negotiating an exit package should be more common practice than it is, my guess is that they might have been feeling that too. And so while, you know what I mean, it was just sort of the perfect storm for you in both of those cases. But I think if you run a good process, if you hire the right person, if you know what you want and you know what success looks like and you get them in the role, the likelihood that they're going to join and be like, I'm just going to take advantage of this exit package and start that process all over again feels really, really low to me.
Yeah.
You're actually right. No, she's right.
Listen.
In both of those cases, we did have gaps in the process. And then we ultimately had, it wasn't a role change, but it was like responsibility changed in both of those cases. And so you're right that is a gap in my remembering of what happened in those cases. I just remember one case to where it was like, it literally took an extra 3 weeks to negotiate it. And I was like, this is fucking outrageous.
Oh, that's right.
Like,
you were scarred with the process.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it was like back and forth with that person's lawyer. And I'm just like, what the fuck are we doing here? Like you haven't provided an ounce of work and I'm spending all of my time negotiating for when you leave. Yeah. You haven't even started. And so it just like annoyed me, but I do think, yeah. And I do think you're right though, Michelle, is like, we didn't have great processes for either of those candidates. And then I'm also scarred because N of 2, both of those people leave in a year. And I'm just like, what the fuck are we doing?
There is a more positive spin on this, which is I think it's also beneficial instead of pre-negotiating your severance for the average employee to pre-negotiate their refresh. What are the milestones at year 1 or year 2? What should my impact be? Like clearly, what should my impact be to get a refresh that is meaningful? I think is potentially interesting. Any more positive spin instead of joining thinking you're leaving, it's joining thinking I'm going to crush this and you're going to want to keep me so much that it makes sense for us to do this.
This has been like my favorite episode so far.
This is
and
great.
I still have like another question for you.
This is great.
Holy shit. Like I'm just going to try and like settle myself after learning so much so far. So last question is, you're now an operating partner at one of the best early stage VCs in the world. What are the common mistakes that founders make and how can HR and other operators help these founders?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are 3, maybe 4, but I'd say there are 3 mistakes that I think founders make very often. The first one is probably going to feel controversial, which is they mistake lots of activity and working long hours for productivity. They glorify the grind of a startup. And I think that's a mask for we actually don't have operating rigor. And this is not really about the downside of long hours, more about the risk that they churn through talent and set really bad foundations for how work gets done, which is going to burn them as they scale. So that's the first one. The second thing is I hear a lot of founders talking about culture, and I'm not sure that they've actually grokked onto the fact that your culture is the primary tool to sustain peak performance, to enable your employees to have an impact and to do it fairly autonomously and to make hard decisions easier. And so I think founders don't actually understand why they care about culture. And I think they wait too long to codify it. And then the last thing, and probably the most detrimental thing, I think, is they don't actively reinvent or reinvest in themselves at each stage of growth. And so they stay the same person they were, and they don't actually scale with the organization in the way that they need to. And I like, in terms of how HR helps, like, I tend to think that the HR role and the ops role are kind of like becoming one in a lot of ways. And so I will say this, to sustain peak performance, you need to know what it looks like. You need to know what matters. Your employees need to know, how do I work on only the things that are going to drive this business forward at any given time? And your guiding principles should drive that culture and make it clear what to do when you're faced with a trade-off or a hard decision. And I see founders all the time create these goals and missions, their principles, how they want to behave. And the minute it becomes uncomfortable for them to use them, they waver. Or they make a decision that isn't actually aligned with principles that bleeds into the rest of the organization and creates a lot of uncertainty for how work gets done, how decisions are made, all that stuff. And everything slows down to a halt. And I think a truly strategic HR leader who also operates like a CEO can design HR programs to mitigate this and can help founders to minimize the discomfort that comes with those trade-offs. And specifically as it relates to actively reinventing or reinvesting in themselves. I wrote this down because it sticks with me. Satya Nadella said this thing about being a CEO, which was, it's a lonely place. You've got to be the one to take some risk, and that emanates from your worldview. As a CEO, you have to have an absolute first-class view of where the world is going. And I like this because being a CEO is uncomfortable. It's lonely. You have to be comfortable taking risks. You're doing a lot of things for the first time. And I think early CEOs run the risk of getting to a good place in their learning and becoming complacent and not realizing that with each stage of growth, their world is changing, their company is changing, their role is changing, where they need to be spending time has changed. And if you think about it, the first job of a CEO founder is not very CEO-y, right? The number one goal is building something cool and finding people who want to use it. They delegate nothing. They're talking to customers. They're writing code. They're making design decisions. They're interviewing and hiring every single person that joins. And it's not really about building a company. It's just about generating enough demand for your product that you have to hire more people, right? But once you move past that product market fit phase, CEOs get confused about what their role is. And I have this thing I say all the time, which is that the CEOs who need help think they're building a really precious product. And for a while they are, but the best CEOs realize that they're actually building a company. And when they realize that, it becomes clear that they need to step away from a lot of the early CEO activities. And that's hard. And this is where a really strong HR leader comes into play, helps them do that, makes them better, teaches them delegating. And the last thing I will say, because I realize I've been talking forever, is as a CEO delegates, there are three things they will never delegate: culture, pushing alignment and vision, and hiring. And all of those things that a CEO cannot delegate are squarely in the wheelhouse of a strong HR leader. And an HR leader can help them with all of those things that always have to be done by them.
Yeah, I could not agree more. Well said. And your second point about helping to codify and build a culture at that time where the CEO moves from building a product to building a company, it is insane how important that is. And I coach founders all the time that it is an invisible headwind or a tailwind. It's going to be one or the other. And you can't see it. You might not see it in dollars, but holy shit, does it impact your P&L more than you'll ever know?
Yes.
Like it is.
And it changes. It constantly changes as the company becomes more successful. And so it's not like the 10 commandments that never updates. It actually should be updated as the company continues to grow.
Yes. I agree with that.
Damn, Michelle, I've learned so
awesome.
much in this conversation. Our audience is going to love this episode. Where can people find you?
Well, I'm at Felicis. You can find me on LinkedIn. I am actively not on Twitter, which is also controversial, or X, sorry, which is also controversial, but you should connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to have these kinds of conversations. I love connecting with really bright people. And so find me out there.
Michelle, thank you so much for the time. This has been awesome.
Thank you so much.
Great.
HR Heretics is a podcast from Turpentine, the network behind Econ 102, Moment is Zen, and Turpentine VC. Subscribe, 5 stars, share it on Apple, YouTube, Spotify, anywhere you get your podcasts, all the things.